All right, so we've just been showing you live visuals from Soweto, the top six, really pushing this theme of renewal in the party. And one of the big issues we're going to zone in on tonight is ANC plans around land, with the issues of land expropriation becoming the focus ahead of the 2019 elections. The president of the party, Cyril Ramaphosa, says that the ANC is focusing on seeking land expropriation without compensation, but he's repeatedly said that South Africans should not be worried. So is this the case? Joining us from our Seapoint studio is the director at the Centre for Constitutional Rights, Phephelaphi Dube, who focuses on land expropriation. Ms. Dube, thank you for being with us. Firstly, is it possible to expropriate land without compensation on one hand, whether we care about them or not? Investors are possibly deterred by that. So then on the other hand, can we still grow the economy? Is what Cyril Ramaphosa is saying actually plausible?
Well, I think we first of all need to look at the constitutional scheme insofar as it relates to property. And in this regard, Section 25 of the Constitution does two things. So it first of all tries to protect existing property rights. But of course, in saying that, it doesn't mean that there can ever be complete protection of property rights. It simply protects property rights insofar as the state can't arbitrarily deprive individuals of property. And then the second aim of the property clause is to ensure equitable access to resources. So that's where land reform comes in. So of course, it's quite clear that from the property clause itself, there is an underlying tension which exists between, on the one hand, protecting property rights, and on the other hand, ensuring that more South Africans can enter the property market, that more South Africans have secure tenure, that farm workers, for example, aren't being arbitrarily evicted from the farms, etc. So I think ultimately the ANC resolution is an attempt at meeting those two seemingly competing demands of the property clause. And of course, just bearing in mind the important caveat that the ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa announced, the fact that even though the ANC intends to go ahead with amending the Constitution insofar as it's going to allow expropriation without compensation, he did make it clear that it still has to be in a manner which is obviously with due process and in a manner which doesn't disturb the food production, and in a manner which still leaves, the sustainable use of land, and that, South Africa's agricultural sector doesn't suffer harm. But of course, I think just given the fact that we haven't been very successful, at least the state hasn't been very successful so far in terms of implementing its policies, I think it's going to be a very difficult journey going forward, because there really hasn't been much that's been done that would really reassure investors, or indeed anybody that's looking into investing in property or in agriculture in a big way. There really isn't much that's going to assure them that indeed these caveats that the ANC Deputy President has mentioned, that those caveats are going to be in place.
Yeah, and you're talking about a very difficult balancing act. You're talking about sections of the Constitution, and some lawyers say, why is there this big hoo-ha? Because the Constitution, in fact, already allows for land expropriation without compensation. I think it's quite clear it has to be in the public interest or something like that. But isn't there a tool there already that the ANC could have used and it's chosen not to? Or correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, you're right in the sense that the property clause as it stands really does allow the state to embark on, well, I obviously don't want to use the word radical because it obviously comes with its own political connotations, but it does allow the state to transform land reform. It does allow the state to transform South Africa's, property rights holding in a very dramatic manner. But of course, we also need to look at ANC policies in insofar as they relate to the property clause, in the sense that, as far back as when the Constitution was adopted, the ANC had adopted a willing buyer, willing seller basis for land reform. And of course, this was reflected in certain policies. And it wasn't until probably 2007 that the ANC started talking about, well, we probably don't need to have a willing buyer, willing seller policy. But even then, that didn't translate into tangible policies on the ground. So based on that, we need to consider the fact that the Constitution does not talk about market value, or rather it does include market value, but market value is just but one of the factors that need to be taken into consideration if the state is paying compensation for expropriation. So the other factors that the state has to consider in addition to market value are factors such as the history of the property, the fact that and the current use of the property. So of course, distinguishing between a house that's used as a place of dwelling, distinguishing between a farm, distinguishing between land that's used as for mining purposes, and also considering some of the subsidies that might have gone into purchasing that property in the past. For example, we do know that the government before 1994 was heavily involved in providing subsidies to certain sectors of South Africa's population. So of course, if those kinds of properties are going to be expropriated, then it wouldn't be just and equitable to pay market value for a property where the owner had received incredible subsidies from the government prior to 1994. So of course, if one considers all of that, I wouldn't think that there's a very strong case to amend the property clause, because the property clause already recognizes that compensation does not have to be at market value. And it's also a property clause that's well aware of South Africa's past. So it does reflect, the policy concerns. It does reflect, South Africa's very troubled history. But of course, the problem is that we've never really taken this question to the Constitutional Court. So it's never been a question that the courts have ever had to interpret. Okay. So at the moment, we're really going by the whims of how political parties understand the property clause to be.
All right, so maybe it's more a policy issue than a legal issue if that's already allowed, although it hasn't been tested. What information do we have? Cyril Ramaphosa mentioning something that's a big issue, that government owns huge tracts of land, and we need to know how much government could redistribute. Then do we know exactly how, what land is contentious? Is it being held by commercial farmers? Who actually owns that land? How much wealth is actually in the land rather than the urban areas or having left the country already? Do we know, do we have any idea about those things?
I think your question hits the nail on the head insofar as we talk about policy uncertainty regarding land reform, because the simple fact is that we haven't had a state land audit. I think the last state land audit we had was in 2002, and even then the results of that state land audit are heavily contested, because it just appeared as if there were instances in which land belonging to traditional communities was viewed to be land that belonged to the state. So of course the end results were very much skewed. Of course, there have been talks, there have been reports about a new state land audit, which was supposed to have been released at the end of 2017, and apparently it's with cabinet, but as yet no members of the public have been privy to that particular report. And then there have been other reports that have been conducted by private individuals, and I think in this regard, Agri SA last year, I think in conjunction with one of the big auditing firms, conducted a state land, an audit of South Africa's land holding. But even then, that particular report is also subject to some debate, because it just appeared as if they didn't distinguish between state-led efforts to reform land. They didn't distinguish that from Black South Africans who simply entered the market on their own. So the argument concerning that result is that it seemed to conflate state-led efforts with private initiatives. So based on that, we really don't know what the state holds, and we're mostly working on mostly working on what is rumored. And of course, that obviously creates policy problems if we don't have the facts and if we don't have the figures. So, for example, we've got the Regulation of Land Holdings Bill. So the Regulation of Land Holdings Bill seeks to prohibit foreign owners from owning agricultural land in South Africa. But at the same time, it's also going to establish a land commission. And in terms of that same bill, the Land Commission is then going to be tasked with trying to get the aggregates of land ownership, aggregates in terms of race, gender, and nationality. So, of course, it just appears as if we're working backwards in that we've got this law, or if Parliament then decides to pass it into law, it will very well be a law which seeks to ban foreigners from owning land in South Africa, but at the same time, we don't really know how much land those same foreigners own. So I think all of this really contributes to the current policy confusion that we're seeing.
All right, so what everybody's crying out for is information, and I guess to avoid policy uncertainty, decisions taken quickly. I will follow that issue. Going to be a very contentious and important issue for us in South Africa this year.